seasons of the year has just come and gone. From early October until the end of December, I revel in the cooler temperatures, the changing of the leaves, the arrival of carved pumpkins on front porches, trick-or-treaters decked out in their scariest costumes, overflowing Thanksgiving tables, colored Christmas lights, brightly wrapped gifts, and Advent and Christmas music in worship. Those days when there is more dark than light are lit up by bright, white, and multicolored lights, trees in windows, wreaths on doors, lights over bushes. There are lights everywhere. The last part of the year is a festive season, all decked out for a full 3 months in holiday finery. And as the days become shorter through those months of October and November and December, we have found ways to brighten the darkness all the way up until the glowing ball drops on New Year's Eve. And then everything stops. The colored lights are packed up. The bright wrapping paper is thrown in the trash. The glowing ball is unplugged and stored away until the next New Year. And what once was bright suddenly goes dark. My heart always hurts a little bit in early January. Houses are stripped and dark. The weather is cold. People are rushing from one place to another just to avoid being out in the cold for too long. Folks have that post-Christmas sag in their shoulders, some from exhaustion and some from loneliness and sadness. And it still gets dark early, but there are no bright lights to cut through the cold darkness. And no matter what we do to push away that dark for a while, what we do can only last for so long. And it's difficult when it's thrust upon us and we can do nothing about it. And I know that you know what I'm talking about, because often when you and I are sitting around in the tables in the fellowship hall, or when we have a moment and we're standing in the hallways, or I see you out and about town and we chit-chat for a minute, the conversation turns to the ice storm of 2009. And that was before we got here. But when you share your stories, I feel like I was there with you too, going through all of this, surviving those days of freezing temperatures with no heat, no electricity, huddled around gas fireplaces and devising creative ways to cook and eat and pass the time. It was so dark and so cold and so quiet, you tell me, except for the trees that we could hear breaking and falling. If you picked up one of the Advent Meditations books this Advent season, maybe you read Peggy Tripp's composition. She writes about the ice storm. She says, "Light has a different meaning to me after having very little light during the 2009 ice storm. During those 7 days of no power and the devastation all around us, I would walk through the house as darkness set in, looking out windows, hoping to see a small light flickering somewhere in the distance. I was looking for a light to give me comfort and security. I did not like being in the dark. None of us like being in the dark without a way to bring forth light when we want it." The beginning of Genesis tells us that darkness covered the face of the deep. Now, when I imagine that kind of darkness, I imagine sheer, silent darkness, cold and blanketing darkness, life-swallowing darkness, ice storm darkness. And we do our best to keep this kind of darkness at bay. Early in the fall, we sense it coming, And so we turn on lights and we throw celebrations with colored lights in our noisy parties, but we can't keep the darkness at arm's length forever. It finds us when the power runs out, when the dinner party is over, and when we are all alone in our car. It finds us when relationships end, when depression suddenly grabs hold, when the money doesn't go far enough, when dreams die, and when life doesn't go as we had hoped. It finds us when we lose members of our family, and it finds us when we lose members of our Immanuel family, like it found us this week when we lost Bob Thomas and Jim Reed. And darkness covered the face of the deep. But then Genesis says, a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Even in the middle of that life-swallowing darkness, God is there. When all is void and null, God is there. When nothing else exists except for the darkness, God is there. Genesis 1 reminds us that we are never alone. As much as we may feel it, we are never alone. Even when we feel like all have abandoned us and there is nothing but darkness to swallow us, God is there, moving over the face of those dark waters, anticipating the next move, shifting and moving in ways that we know nothing about. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God spoke. All it took was for God to speak. That's it. God spoke, and light came into being. God spoke, and darkness cowed to light. God spoke, and something hard and unbending gave way to something clear and bright. And so God speaks to the darkness in us. God speaks light into our being, clearing confusion and bringing our bleary eyes into focus. What once was muddy and heavy becomes clear and ordered. What once weighed our soul down in a black hole gives way and moves a little and is manageable. We can move again. We can breathe again. We can see again. Genesis 1 reminds us to have hope that God really is doing something that we can't even imagine with the chaos and the darkness and the emptiness. Genesis 1 reminds us to hold on and to hold out hope. Those first few verses in our Bible call us to remember that in the beginning of it all, in the very beginning, there was God moving and shifting and drawing order out of all that chaos. Now, John 1 reminds us that Jesus was there with God in the beginning too, shifting and moving, creating something extraordinary out of that muck. And sometimes it is just muck, all of it. John 1 reminds us that with Jesus comes light and life, and the darkness can never overtake that light. Yesterday, we celebrated the life of Bob Thomas, and this past week has been very difficult for Bob's family, as you would imagine. And there has been great darkness and great sadness in the wake of his death. But even in the middle of the darkness of death, in the very middle of that darkness, in the black hole of sadness, in the middle of those hard days, there was light. There was light. There was the light of God's love reflected in the love between Bob and his family. There was the light of Bob's life and stories from people he encountered. All of a sudden, Jesus was present. In those stories, they told about how Bob was a musician, how he could pick up any instrument and play it by ear, like that. I can't do that. Makes the world more beautiful and makes the rest of us jealous, right? When he was young, he backed up several musicians who played on a Knoxville, Tennessee radio show, and maybe you've heard of some of them. Mother Maybelle, June Carter Cash, Chet Atkins, and Kitty Wells. But as Bob married Pat and they started a family, Bob decided to use his musical talent for other people. And so his daughter Marie was in the school band from 5th grade on up through senior high school, and Bob volunteered as the assistant band director in Marie's school. He could play any instrument, and he could fix any instrument too. Bob shared who he was with those children and those teenagers. And Bob was light to a school band. Bob was also instrumental in getting a skating rink built in Simpsonia. He was concerned that the children in that community didn't have enough activities, and so he worked within that community and with other community leaders to get a skating rink constructed. And this gave children and families a place to gather and spend time together. Bob also organized the first scout troop in Simpsonia, and he was the scoutmaster for years until someone committed enough to the troop came along to lead it, and that person turned out to be one of his former scouts. During the holidays, Bob would barbecue pork shoulders and deliver them to people around town. A gentleman came up to me after the service yesterday and said that he helped Bob do that, and one year, I think he said they barbecued 60 pork shoulders to share with folks. And Bob and Pat often opened their home to folks who needed a place to stay until they could get on their feet. And in all these stories, people spoke of Bob's kindness and his gentleness, his compassion and care, his thoughtfulness and his selfless way. They spoke of how Bob cared for other people and how he gave of himself to make others' lives better. In all those stories, what I heard was that Bob reflected Jesus' light. This light of the world who came for us was very present in Bob's life. Bob reflected Jesus' kindness and mercy and compassion. And for lots of people who knew Bob and experienced his gentle spirit, God's light really did shine in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. The light that lived in Bob lives in us too, for Jesus is the light and the life. And we are called to reflect Jesus' light in the same way that Bob did. Jesus calls us to live like him, to cultivate kindness and forgiveness and compassion and mercy and peace. And that's not just something that we talk about, but it's something that we do. For that's how Jesus lived, and that's how Jesus can live through us. All these things, forgiveness and mercy and peace and compassion, hope, all these things bring light. And darkness can never, ever overcome that kind of light. And when that kind of light shines, we still see God creating, moving and shifting and bringing order out of chaos for us and our world. In her Advent meditation, Peggy ends by sharing a Christmas tradition that she has. She writes, "One of my favorite things to do during the Christmas season is to read Barbara Robinson's book, The Best Christmas Pageant Ever." She ends the story about the Herdman kids and the annual Christmas pageant with these words. "When we came out of the church that night, it was clear and cold, with crunchy snow underfoot and bright, bright stars overhead. And I thought about the angel of the Lord, Gladys, with her skinny legs and her dirty sneakers, sticking out from under her robe, yelling at all of us everywhere, "Hey, unto you a child is born! Hey, unto you a child is born!" Have you ever realized what a difference that really makes? Jesus, the light of the world, became a human being and lived among us to teach us and show us what God's love is like. And because we know what Jesus is like, because he's been here, we know what God is like. Now it's time for us to reflect that light. So like Gladys, we can shout too, "Hey, unto you a child is born." Yes, hope has found us. Light really is dispersing the darkness. Joy and peace and love are here because Jesus is here and with us always. Amen.